Hey, Joe here from Home Studio Corner. If you're new to me and to Home Studio Corner, you may not realize I'm kind of the stock plugin guy. Not sure if that's intentional or not, but just over the years, it just so happens that I've mixed dozens, if not hundreds of songs using just the stock plugins that come with my DAW. Most of that is just by the sheer nature that it's just there and I use it and it doesn't sound bad. And so that's what I use. I'm not against fancy third-party plugins. I just firmly believe, and I know for a fact, that if you can't get a good sounding mix using the stock plugins in your DAW, whatever DAW you're using, then you're not going to be able to suddenly get great sounding mixes with fancy plugins, ones that emulate really cool pieces of analog hardware. Will those fancy plugins give you a better sound overall? Quite possibly. Will they change your ability to hear things in the mix and fix problems and make the mix sound good? No, that's something you've got to do. So if you're working on a mix and the mix isn't sounding good, there's one of two problems at play. One, the recording's not great, and so there's no chance of getting a good mix. That's why I talk all the time about how important it is to get it right at the source. If the tracks don't already sound awesome in their raw form, then no amount of mixing is going to suddenly make them awesome. That's point number one. Point number two, you might just not be very good at mixing yet. The good news is you can learn, and that might offend some people, but if you're not getting good sounding mixes, it's because you're not very good at mixing yet, if the tracks themselves are good, okay? So that means a fancy bundle of plugins is not going to solve that core problem of you just not being very good yet. Now, if I've offended you, you can click the thumbs down and go away if you want, or you can stick around and I can help you get better at mixing, right? That's kind of what I do. Okay, so what we're going to do, this is going to be a 3-part video series. In this video, I'm going to mix a song, drums specifically, using fancier plugins. So Studio One has a fat channel thing that allows you to swap out. They just released a bunch of new emulations of really cool analog compressors and EQs that they allowed me to have for free. Thanks, Frizonas, in exchange for doing some videos. I've mixed some drums using those, and it sounds great, and I think it sounds awesome. It's a killer drum mix. In the next video, I'm going to get rid of all those plugins, do the drum mix again using only stock plugins, specifically the stock Pro EQ and the stock compressor, and that's it. And then in the third video, we'll come back and compare the two and see, is there a huge difference or do they both work? I'm very biased. I'm assuming it's going to be the answer is they both work. But let's find out and see for sure. I'm kind of been on this kick of instead of just saying what I think or know to be true, let's put my money where my mouth is and actually test it in real life. So here's a song that I just mixed recently, and you may have heard it in a recent video. It's a song we're mixing over at Dueling Mixes this month. Give you a quick listen to the final mix. And now just the drums. This is the final drum mix. Drums, there's a lot of subjectivity there. I'm a big fan of big old beefy sounding drums, especially the kick drum. You could argue the kick drum's too loud, and I would say you're probably right, but I like it. I'm going to leave it where it is. So let me play you the drum mix without plugins, and I'll turn the plugins back on. So here's the raw files before I processed anything, and then I'll click the plugins on and go back and forth a couple of times. You'll know they're on when you see them all light up. Okay, here we go. First thing you notice is the raw tracks don't sound too bad. Kick and snare sound good. Got a decent sounding overhead, decent sounding room sound. It's all sounding like a pretty good kit. Once it's mixed, the kick is punchier, the snare is snappier and a little more in your face, and the overhead and room mics are contained in a way that gives us nice ambience and nice cymbal sprinkliness without it being over the top. And it basically gives us a drum mix that will cut through when we're listening to the entire mix. You may notice there's a little bit of a guitar you're hearing in the drums. This was all tracked live, and there's a little bleed from I think everything, even the vocals. You'll hear a little bit of that throughout. Don't worry about it. It will not make a difference at all. Okay, so let me turn these plugins back off and let me just show you what I did. So again, this is my mix where I used some fancy plugins. I used a couple of the stock EQs as well, but I did use some of the fancier analog emulations, and that's what we're going to walk you through what I did to mix this song. So first off, let's listen to the raw files again. Great starting point. I will note, they did use samples for this song. The original kick drum actually sounds like this. So clearly something went wrong there. If I had been producing this session, and now I've jacked up many a drum recording, I will raise my hand and admit it. So I'm not against samples. They used that sample to trigger a nicer sounding sample, which is this one. But had I been at the session, hopefully somebody should have said, hey, that doesn't sound right, let's fix it. I've been in sessions, there's a lot going on, especially if you've got more than just drums being recorded. So it's completely understandable. In a perfect world, we would have captured a better sounding kick there. So we didn't. I didn't want to try to rescue that kick drum sound. It wasn't working. I'm using the sample that was provided to me, which works pretty well. So let's just work through what I did on the kick drum first. So here's my kick drum sound. Thing you probably noticed right off the bat, it's got a lot of low end, pretty good sounding kick, but there's a big room sound behind it. Typically, you don't get a lot of room sound in your kick drum mic, but I did. So we're going to figure out if that's going to be a problem or not. So a couple things that I did, I used compression and EQ, pretty standard stuff. Compression, I'm trying to get a nice snappy sound to it, and I'm also trying to use compression to tame some of that room sound. I'll show you what I mean here. Here's the kick without compression, then I'll turn the compressor on by flicking this switch. Okay, gives it a little more snap, it's a little louder, and the way the release is set up, I'm using a fairly slow attack and a somewhat quick release, and that release is taking its time getting back, which means the room sound is going to be turned down a little bit, which helps. Versus a fast release. It's pretty subtle. I thought it was more obvious than it was. Just feels a little punchier. So forget the whole release thing, that's not doing much. But the drum itself, if I turn it up a little bit, you'll hear it's got a punch to it that it didn't have without compression. It's got some smack, to use Graham Cochran's term, and some punch. Now I run it into an EQ. So I typically compress first if I kind of like the sound, EQ first if I need to fix the sound. There's no real hard and fast rule. That's just what I do sometimes. So after that, I jacked up the low end to give me a big, thick low end. So a big boost of 7 dB at 220 hertz, which is a shelf. So it's everything 220 and below. Then I took out some mid-range where the boxy frequencies are. And that, I'll start without the EQ, then I'll turn it on. Just turns it into this big, awesome sounding kick drum. I love it so much. It's got plenty of snap, plenty of low end. For the snare drum, I did absolutely nothing. We got snare top and snare bottom that sound like this. And then they added a snare sample, which sounds pretty good. I decided to blend them all together for this. And you'll notice I did nothing on the snare track. That seems like some sort of rule that I've broken, right? How dare he not process the snare drum? Well, I did that because I got the sound that I wanted just using the processing on my drum bus. I'll show you that in a second. Let's go to the toms really quickly. The toms play here. Let's go, here's where they both play. So they're a little muffled sounding. So on each drum, I pulled up just a standard EQ, took out some of that mid-range muffled, this sound. That go kind of in there. Took that out and then did the same thing on the other drum, the lower tom. So pretty similar EQ on both. That made them sound a little bit better. Then I ran them through a fat channel, and all I did on the fat channel was do some EQ. So if I turn that on, you'll see I took more mid-range out, okay? Boosted the low end at 100 hertz and below. I want my toms to sound like kick drums usually, little mini kick drums, and then boosted the top end quite a bit up in 3K or so to get some snap out of them. So here it is without that EQ, and now with that EQ. A little beefier, a little snappier in the mix. You can hear it a little better. Okay, that's great. Overhead, I did nothing. I thought it sounded fine. And then room mics. Room mics is where I had some fun. Here's the raw sound of the room mic. I thought that's cool. It's stereo, it's wide. Let's crush it. That's what you typically do, especially around Nashville. They love to crush their room mics. So I pulled in that same compressor I was using on the kick drum, and I just slammed it. Also EQ'd out a bunch of mid-range so it didn't sound so boxy. So here it is without EQ and compression. And here it is with. So all I'm going for here is to give me that nice, when the snare hits, that wah after the snare to really define the room sound. Combine that with our snare mic. Brings the drum mix to life. And then we got shaker and tambourine. Again, no plugins there. Also on the room mic, I rolled off some of the highs because the cymbals were too loud in the room. You'll hear that in a second. Now, the big player, the big place where I get most of my drum tone and most of my drum mixes is here on the drum bus. I'll usually do this first in the mix. I'll get a good static mix, and then I'll put this on there. And usually it's a combination of EQ, taking a little mid-range out, boosting a little low end, and some sort of compressor. So first, let's start with the compressor. Let me turn it on. Here's our drum mix. When you see that light flick on, you'll hear the compression. Really working on that snare drum, which remember has no EQ or compression up to this point. And now I'm thinking, okay, my overall drum mix feels good. A little mid-range, you could use a little more low end, a little more upper mids and top end for some clarity. And that's what the EQ did for me, and it did it beautifully. So I'll start without the EQ, then I'll turn it on. This is a great example of how one plug-in, two functions, a compressor and an EQ, completely transform the entire drum mix with just a compressor and one EQ. I'll turn the whole thing off and turn it back on so you can hear it again. This is something that I am so glad I stumbled upon a couple years ago, where I processed the whole drum bus first. Then I'll go individual processing on some of the pieces of the kit if they need it, but a lot of times they don't, especially if the performance and the samples and the sounds and the recordings themselves are working. So now let me pull back in the entire band and you can hear what that sounds like in context. All right, that's it for this video of using some of the fancier plugins to get what I think is a great sounding drum mix. In the next video, I'll wipe out all these plugins. First, I'm going to render this. Then I'll wipe out all the plugins and add just the stock compressor and EQ and see if I can get similar results. And then the final video, we'll compare the two and we'll decide together, was it worth it or not? All right, thanks for watching. See you in the next one.